Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to TEDxYouth at DAA. Today, you're going to hear from many talented speakers on the concept of inertia in a more metaphorical sense, in the sense of their lives and their experiences. I'm also here to tell you about inertia, the real inertia, known in physics. To that end, I'm going to tell you how to get a rocket to Mars from Earth, obviously. Now, before I go on a 10 minutes physics ramble, I have to tell you first that this is actually rocket science, and I am not a rocket scientist, nor am I an astronaut or anyone who's qualified to talk to this. However, I have read a number of accredited academic journals from very well-reviewed publishers, such as Alpert and Musser, in their brilliant paper, How to Go to Mars, published in Scientific American, along with many other NASA and other space organization publications. So I am very confident that I can tell you all this information well. So I'm going to assume you're all completely unfamiliar with space and rockets and everything else. So I'm going to start at square one. Square one. First, inertia, otherwise known as mass, is an intrinsic property of all massive objects, which describes their resistance to a change in velocity. It's a lot harder to move a shelf than it is to move a feather. Second, on Earth, when we accelerate and then we stop accelerating, we accelerate negatively, we slow down, because of the forces imposed on us by air resistance and the friction of our feet on the floor. This is why it's very difficult to run 100 meters in less than 10 seconds, and why it takes 5 hours for a plane to cross the Atlantic. Now, space doesn't have this problem. In space, it's hard to start moving, to stop moving, to change direction, because the inertia of your body carries you forward and keeps you moving in a relatively straight line at relatively the same speed, unless you apply a balancing force yourself to change that speed and to limit it. Furthermore, there are other planets in space than Earth, I know, which pull you towards them due to their gravity. Third, the scale of the solar system is very difficult to visualize to scale, and it's even harder for you to visualize mentally. And the distances between planets vary constantly because they keep orbiting around the sun. The distance between Mars and Earth, according to NASA, goes from anywhere between 0.35 to 2.26 astronomical units, where 1 astronomical unit is the average distance between Earth and the sun. In metric units, that's 160 million to 400 million kilometers. To put that into context, that's the circumference of the Earth at its equator is only 40,000 kilometers, which is 3 orders of magnitude smaller. Ideally, you want to move between planets when the distance between them is at a minimum. The most direct path between the planets would be a straight line right between them. So obviously, planets are often on other sides of the sun, which, for very obvious reasons, we cannot exactly move through the sun. However, luckily and conveniently, planets orbit around the sun, again. So actually, we just have to wait, because once every 26 months, the planets align in a perfect transfer position so that we can move between them and transfer to square 2. We have to actually leave Earth. Now, it takes a lot of effort to get off of Earth. It takes a lot of thrust, because Earth's pretty big, and so it has a lot of gravity, especially here on the surface. So it takes a lot of thrust to escape that gravity. Luckily, rocket scientists come up with a brilliant contraption to overcome this challenge: a rocket. So, leaving Earth, Earth has gravity. Also, there are other forces like air resistance. So we can't exactly just keep going straight up. However, rocket scientists come up with another brilliant strategy. First, the rocket will launch vertically. However, immediately after launching, it will perform a maneuver called a gravity turn, which will point its nose towards the surface of the Earth until it is completely parallel to the surface and only accelerating parallel to the surface of the Earth. Why? Because if you kept moving straight up, the rocket would eventually run out of fuel, which is not ideal because gravity is applied constantly, and so as it ran out of fuel, it wouldn't be able to apply a balancing force to keep itself in the air. and it would plummet down to Earth and spontaneously combust, which is not ideal. So instead, we take advantage of a phenomenon known as circular motion, or orbiting, which occurs when a spacecraft has a significant velocity tangent or parallel to the surface of the planet, while also being pulled towards it, so that as it's being pulled towards the surface of the planet, its parallel velocity is so significant that as it falls, it misses the planet, falling back around and circling back around, thereby staying right above it. And so, square 3, transferring between the planets. To transfer between the planets, you need to perform a simple maneuver called a Hohmann transfer, which is essentially a transfer between two orbits around the same massive object, which allows you to move between them. It is done first by accelerating once at any point on the original orbit, and then creating an ellipse. That ellipse will intersect the higher orbit. At one point, you move to that point, and then you accelerate again there to circularize the orbit at the new altitude. That wasn't so simple. Anyways, why is it done? Well, this is the most efficient transfer between the two planets. Any other transfer would require exponentially more fuel, which would add exponentially more mass to the spacecraft, which is already pretty massive, which we don't want. Furthermore, there are other paths which obviously aren't very efficient, and there are other bodies in space, and there are a lot of factors to consider. So this mitigates those factors, and instead, through calculations and through error, this has been determined to be the most efficient transfer. And so, square 4, as we move between the planets, it's going to take several months to transfer between the planets because space is big. So we can fast forward that and cut straight to the landing. Now, we're moving at a very, 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 very fast speed. Moving at this speed towards the planet would undoubtedly cause a collision, and the rocket would experience a rapid and unscheduled disassembly, which is not ideal. And so, instead, we need to land safely on the planet. There are a number of things to consider when landing safely. First of all, the mass of the rocket, its payload, what it's carrying, and whether or not it needs to be reused. Furthermore, Mars has an atmosphere. It's very thin. According to NASA, it's only 0.6% the density of Earth's atmosphere, which is still significant at high speeds. Furthermore, Mars has half the size, a tenth the mass, and so a third the gravity, and so there are a lot of considerations. So here's an oversimplified summary of how to land. First, the rocket will approach the planet and be caught by its gravity, entering its orbit. Then it will accelerate against its motion by some means to slow it down and fall into the planet. If it doesn't need it, this is only done if it's actually deploying something in orbit, like a satellite to relay signals for a surface lander. However, if not doing that, then the rocket can simply go straight from an approach from interplanetary space right to the surface of the planet safely. Either case, the rocket will need to perform a maneuver called an aerocapture. An aerocapture is a maneuver which utilizes the planet's atmosphere to slow it down due to air resistance. However, we are moving at a very, 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 very fast speed, which an atmosphere is a large number of particles. Now, individually, each of those particles don't have enough energy to cause any impact. However, kinetic energy is proportional to the velocity of impact. And so, at really, really, really fast speeds, the atmosphere acts like a wall, which will undoubtedly cause another rapid, unscheduled disassembly of the vessel. So, to mitigate this effect, you need to install heat shielding on the surface of the spacecraft, and you need to streamline it so it doesn't spontaneously combust in the atmosphere due to its speed. And so, as it approaches the planet, it begins to land and make contact with the surface, probably slowing down at the end using a combination of big parachutes and thrust downwards towards the surface, finally coming to a close and landing gracefully as it prepares to carry on with whatever mission it was sent there to perform. Thank you for indulging me in my talk about real inertia, and I hope you will enjoy the rest of today's talks, as you have no doubt enjoyed mine, which will undoubtedly also be delightful metaphors.